This is Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell, all talk and all crime. It's our second show on one of the nation's longest, prominent, unsolved murders, 50 years and counting, in fact. A reinvestigation into the murder of a U.S. Senator's daughter. We dive deeper into the suspect our guest uncovered in an attempt to solve the cold case. That's today on Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. Glen Wall is an investigative journalist out of Chicago. His groundbreaking book on the unsolved murder of former Illinois Senator Charles Percy's daughter is Sympathy Vote, a reinvestigation of the Valerie Percy murder. And today we're also going to get into the book by the alleged suspect's wife, that's Louise Thorson, entitled It Gave Everyone Something to Do, co-written with E.M. Nathanson, who was the author of the bestseller, then made into a movie, The Dirty Dozen. Welcome back, Glenn.
Thanks, Jim.
Good to have you. And is telling our folks here in the Greenwich area that this is a case that was personal to me because I grew up in Chicago. I interned for the senator. I swam in his pool, indoor pool, even in Kenilworth. And there's similarities to Greenwich in that Kenilworth is a high net worth, very small community like Bellhaven, and that's where the Moxley murder occurred. And the honeymoon cruise, which we've also been following, was based on a resident of Greenwich who died on his honeymoon cruise, unsolved. The Moxley murder case solved, but then again unsolved, now appeal. And the Percy case unsolved. So we're on all these cases. We're going to continue to do shows on them. And to start us off, Glenn, tell folks who don't know, refresh us on the story, the tragic murder.
Well, Valerie Percy was the daughter or twin daughter of Senator, future Senator Percy of Illinois, three-time senator. He was elected in 1966, and she was murdered in their family home about 5 weeks before Election Day in a town that hadn't had a murder in its 75-year history. And, obviously because of where it happened and the family's prominence, the local authorities and state authorities, assisted by the FBI, threw everything they had at it for a number of years, and nobody could figure out a motive or, there were never any arrests. There were suspects, but it just went unsolved.
I hadn't realized that there had never been a murder there in Kenilworth. I grew up in Lake Forest, just north of there. Mm-hmm. By the way, and I asked you this before, but give us the brief answer. Why do you think such a high-profile crime that the FBI got involved with, the Kenilworth Police Department got involved with, and they weren't experts in murder, obviously, but they brought that in. Why unsolved, 50 years and running?
Well, yes, and Chicago actually was, you could argue, I think make a good argument that from the very beginning, Chicago was directing the case. I think for two reasons. Well, the thing was, you had all these people come in with expertise from Chicago, from the state, and they brought their expertise, but they didn't know the local suspects. They didn't know the local area. They didn't know the history of the crime in the local area. So what they gained with those people, I think they lost. Now, obviously, if the cops had known something or put something together, the local guys, I think they would have, helped and probably did help, but I don't think they put it together. And when they had all these pros come in from the outside, you do not know the extent of which the local guys backed off and said, "Okay, the pros are in there. I've got my job to do. I'll go off and do it." So, I think that was definitely a reason why. Otherwise,
go ahead.
I mean, that's probably the biggest reason why.
All right, let's continue now on this suspect that you uncovered, and I want briefly, just because the wife has written this book, tell us a little bit about her, and is she still alive?
No, she passed away, I believe, in the mid-1990s. She didn't live that long. So, obviously she lived probably 16, 17 years longer than he did, or was it longer than that? He was killed in 1970. She shot him in 1970. So she's not still alive. I actually don't know if their son, they had one son, whether he's still alive. I've heard from one of my sources from the Kenilworth area that he was no longer living when I was working on my book. So
he's not alive or no longer living in near Chicago.
I had heard, he had said that he'd heard that he died.
Oh, interesting.
But there was a man by the same name and the same age living in Georgia, which is where Thorson's ex-wife, or relocated after some point.
Oh, okay.
She was in Georgia, so I don't know. Obviously the police are aware of that, and some reporters in Chicago as well.
Okay. Now, William Thorson III is the suspect, the son of a wealthy scion. But before we get into him, one of the things that obviously has to happen is that Thorson has to be placed in Chicago to be able to have done that murder, had a place in San Francisco, a place in Fresno, lived in Phoenix, and traveled all around. One of the things when I read her book, Glenn, is around September 22nd of 1966, and Valerie's murder was September 18th, I believe. He was in Fort Bragg with his wife presenting a bust of JFK, and then getting arrested for stealing bikes. So the guy's crazy.
Right.
Do you?
Right. You couldn't come up with crazier.
Exactly. Do you think that it might make it tough for us to be able to place him in Chicago to have been able to do the murder, obviously?
Well, I'm not sure that somebody hasn't tried. Valerie's sister had a lot, was a very wealthy woman and had her own investigation done. I think that Thorson is, in hindsight, there have been other investigations done of Thorson. Mm-hmm. I don't know whether anyone has, as you know, there's a court case going on right now to access the files from the case. I was able to get files on Thorson, but I wasn't able to get anything post 1966 or so.
Do you suspect? Are you concerned that he might have been in North Carolina or why?
No. Well, I don't know how long he was there, but I'm not. My thing is that there was a huge reason for him to be in Kenilworth. On or about September 18th.
There was a huge reason?
There was a huge reason, and I think you had mentioned, when you talked to me before the show, that what's interesting is if you come upon some information and you put it out there into the world, it's fascinating what can come back to you. Yeah. When you're in the middle of swimming into all this stuff. And a theory came back to me, and I can't tell you that I didn't think it was very strange that Thorson had confessed to murdering his brother almost a year to the day. I believe it was September 19th, 1965, in Lake Forest, where you're from. Yeah. And he confessed to being behind that murder. And then Valerie is killed almost a year to the day later. And I thought about that, and a theory came back to me that said, well, why would he be there at that time? And it would be like, well, the family, it's not a stretch to suggest that the family would have had some sort of get-together a year after the murder in memory of his brother, who they did not yet know was behind the murder, that William was behind the murder of Richard Thorson. And so they would have a get-together a year later, and if you look at a calendar from 1966, you'll find that the day that Valerie Percy was murdered was on a Sunday, and the 19th would have been Monday. And so if a family was going to get together for a memorial a year later, the weekend before would be a natural time to have it.
That's very, very interesting. And what's even weird about this Fort Bragg thing is they're giving this bust, which is obviously a very nice thing, and Thorson is a very good-looking, distinguished guy. Right. Then he's arrested for stealing bikes, and at the same time they're doing this, his son almost drowned in the pool of the motel they were staying at. Mm-hmm. You can't make this up.
You can't. I mean, his criminal career, along with some of the other things in his life, makes Fargo look like a PTA meeting. I mean, it's so crazy. And after I did my book, I went back and talked to John McDonough, who was in the police station in the summer of 1965 in Kenilworth, and the police were tied up almost every day with just crazy domestic violence that was going on over there between William and his family. And I asked him, I said, did you ever see this guy? And he said, I saw him all the time. He was in the police department. He was well dressed. He had a very attractive wife. He seemed to be articulate, and and he said, just based on what I saw at the time, I thought he's the kind of guy I would like to be. And,
why is it, by the way, with all this record, and we'll talk about it, the Kenilworth police wouldn't have put him on some sort of top-of-the-list deal.
Well, he left Kenilworth in 1960. He was coming back. He came back. He moved back home in 1965 for the summer, for about half the summer, if I recall correctly. And then the violence just escalated. The brother was still alive, if you remember. The brother was killed in September 19th, 1965. So there was this huge blowout there, William behind all of it, of course. But he left again. The police, for a long time, were very aware of his whereabouts through his family telling them, at least whether he was in Illinois, whether he was in Chicago, whether he was in Kenilworth, or he had been in Kenilworth. And so they were very aware of that, but he didn't officially reside there other than that summer. He had a place in Arizona at the time. I think the brother, and he may have still had his apartment in Chicago. And then he had a place in San Francisco right after the brother died, late 65. So they were aware, but that's a very small police department, usually no more than 2 or 3 people on duty at that time. They were aware. They knew that Thorson had been there. Nobody knew that he was trying to kill his parents.
Yeah.
In the spring of '66, 4 months before Valerie was killed, a block away. But they knew that, but he would come and go, and he didn't live there, and he wasn't welcome there, and he wasn't welcome in his own house.
Yeah.
I think there may have been some reconciliation after the brother died, after that summer of 1965. But we also know the gut feeling of the father was, when Richard died, that William was behind the murder.
All right, we're talking with Glen Wall. He's an investigative journalist. We're looking back at the murder of Senator Percy's daughter, Valerie Percy. She's a twin, in fact, as he mentioned. I have twin daughters, so the whole thing. Let's talk a little bit about the psychology of this suspected murderer and potentially serial killer as we get into more detail. What do you think was behind him? And he seemed obsessed with the hurts that he felt were inflicted by his family.
Right. That's hard to know. I mean, the wife wrote the book. She mentions the parents in many passages, but once again, the wife didn't come into the scene until he was about 20, 21. So she doesn't know. She knew what he said. She interacted with the parents, with the other brother while he was still alive, but they were adults at that time. So it's hard to know. She basically chronicles the gripes that he had against them, that he was being sent away to military school, that it seems very early he became a criminal, a juvenile delinquent, a thief, someone who was breaking and entering people's property very early, like 13, 14 years of age. And I don't know at that point, if there was the rub there against the father or not.
We should say, by the way, that he was going to North Shore Country Day School. His father was the chairman of a big steel corporation. Kenilworth is highly wealthy, so he's not just an average Joe.
No. His father was a multimillionaire in the mid-1960s when $1 million was an almost inconceivable amount of money to a lot of middle-class people.
It was real money.
So you imagine that he was getting in trouble at 14 and such, and ended up maybe getting kicked out of North Shore. I mean, they actually wouldn't admit that he went there.
Do you think that, by the way, that there could have been some abuse in the sense that he represents that he was a normal teen doing stuff like staying out late, etc., and they institutionalized him several times. Do you think he just misinterpreted and in denial himself, or that the family may have overreacted from the start?
Well, he was definitely. He wasn't just staying out late. He was stealing things, and both of the brothers were getting in trouble. I think William was a bad influence for his younger brother, and they were feared. I mean, I saw something on a post online where someone knew the younger brother, and he said, that Richard Thorson was the kind of guy, if you saw him walking down the street, you'd go to the other side of the street. And he said, if he was that bad, I can almost imagine what William was like. I know that William had a bad stuttering problem when he was young. I think that was probably, he was probably bullied for it in those days. I know John McDonough said when he saw them, he said he wasn't aware of that. He was interested when I said that because, but he ended up marrying a speech therapist. So that's another interesting aspect of him and his wife's relationship.
You know that so he's this major league manipulator, taking this middle class girl and basically getting her to lose all her values and start stealing with him. He manipulated his brother right into hatred and convincing him he was a heroin dealer. And then, of course, the ultimate manipulation, he didn't have the guts, so he basically convinced his wife to kill him.
Yes, definitely. At that point, I read that passage of the book again, and I'm not sure whether. I think he knew that she had the gun. I can't remember whether she said for sure she knew that he knew that she was holding the gun at the time that he lunged after her. So he definitely knew before he died that because she pulled the gun up, and I believe he was shot in the back. He was turned around. But
reading that stuff, you really get the effect that he's like pushing every button, threatening her. That he's going to. Right. He's doing everything to either get her to explode or that he's going to kill her.
Right, and I think that he only didn't kill her because he used her so many times, and she was the fall gal, so to speak. She was arrested with the weapons that she was shipping on his behalf in New York a few months after the Percy murder, which of course included bayonets, and that was the first thing that set.
Talk about, by the way, we have a couple of minutes in this segment. Talk about the whole weapons cache, because that not only has some impact on the Percy murder, but it's bizarre. I mean, he was like a small country.
Well, he was, and he obviously had hoarding tendencies, and so here he is going out and buying all of this military weaponry, up to, howitzers, cannons, bazookas, all of this stuff. All he can really get is like World War II era stuff because he can't really get the stuff that's at Fort Bragg at the time. But, and the FBI is going around and trying to, he's meeting with people who are into this stuff and they're parts of militia groups. And they're trying, the FBI is keeping its eye on the militia groups, and then they're wondering who this guy is buying all this stuff and moving it around the country and what for. And they find out a lot about the guy, and he seems to be completely, non-political. He seems to be not interested in anything like that. He just seems to be a lunatic who's collecting all of this stuff. In between being, arrested for stealing posters off the wall in a travel office or a bicycle somewhere. I mean, but there's no doubt that he was a serial killer if you believe his wife's testimony, which she testified in her own defense and convinced a jury that he confessed to murdering 3 people and attempting to murder 3 more.
We're going to go
and
through that.
Those people all either ended up dead or disappeared.
Do you, in about 30 seconds, why would his wife, he cheated on her, he used her, he basically got her arrested, why would she stay with him?
It's very strange, it's kind of a Bonnie and Clyde thing. Why did Bonnie go off with Clyde? She met him in the street, he was a bad guy, he was proud of it, and he got her to help him rob banks. And we all know how that ended up. So it's very strange. I think that she loved him, but I know other people who've read the book and they say she was an odd bird because when they were together very early on, she was aware of his philandering and she just apparently let it go on. Now she had a very conservative upbringing. They had a child, when not too long after they were married, I believe, 2 years after they were married. So why she stayed with him those first couple of years, I don't know, but he obviously wouldn't go away either.
You're listening to Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. Coming next, we'll look at whether Thorson was a serial killer. We're back with our guest, investigative journalist who's re-examined the Percy murder out of Illinois, Glen Wall. And one of the interesting things in the book is he's getting towards the end of his life, and he ends up getting shot, almost like setting up his death as things get worse and worse. He says he killed all the wrong people. And as we see if this guy's a serial killer, let's go through some of them. We've talked a little bit about Richard. He was his brother. And he had all these jealousies and stuff that, again, seemed to be misinterpreted because the brother seemed to worship him when they got along well. But he also got a guy to kill him in Lake Forest using a credit card that was his wife's, a gun his wife had bought. And this is Thorson's wife. And then Thorson kills the guy that kills his brother.
Right.
So talk a little bit about some of these folks he's killed. And we'll talk about he tried to kill his parents.
Well, remember, right when the wife found everything out, which is basically why she killed him, or a big reason why, and she knew that he was telling the truth.
Yeah.
That he had said to her that he was asking her if she understood that he was petrified of being committed, which he was committed numerous times.
Yeah.
And he got out numerous times, going all the way back to his teenage years. There was a sanatorium right there. I believe it was in Winnetka Sanitarium. And he had been in there, and he'd escaped from there, and he'd escaped from the state one in, I believe it was Galesburg.
Yeah, Galesburg.
So, and he was really on the run at that level from those people. I mean, they were looking to pick him up again, and obviously his family was looking to pick him up again. And so, going all the way back to the beginning, he said that when they would sedate him, that he was worried that he was going to spill the beans about what he'd done. And you can only assume that that was the worst thing, murder. And so if you look back that he was, I think he escaped in 59, going all the way back to 1959. Well, what was he so worried about in 1959? Well, the answer to that is he was a suspect in the Judith Mae Anderson murder in 1957, which is one of the most notorious murders in Chicago history. And, I think they still talk to detectives about that. They still have the barrels that her body was found in Belmont Harbor.
And she was a teenager, right?
She was a teenager, and it was just a crazy, horrific crime. And Chicago detectives came out to talk to Kenilworth and talk to him, question him about that, because he had been driving around with a friend and picked up a couple of girls and was talking about stuffing bodies in barrels, and obviously that was really big news at that time. And I think one of those girls, looked at this guy and said, "This guy, he may be joking around, but he's scary." And so the police came out and questioned him. I'm not sure if, as I said in my book, whether the Chicago investigators knew that Thorson's father ran a steel company and that Thorson had worked there, because there was residue from steelmaking production in one of those barrels.
Interesting. Now, he attempted to kill his parents, and again, setting his wife up almost, but to divert the woman who worked in the house. But talk about that.
Well, this was about 4 months before the Percy murder, and if you look at it, he had a plot to try. Now, remember, the brother's already dead, and he's a suspect in that case, and he's got a plot to kill his parents. His father he had the biggest rub with, but apparently he didn't like either of them. And so he hatched a very, very elaborate plot to try and make it look like the father killed everybody in the house and then committed suicide. And that plot required him making a harness that he was going to hoist his father up in and hang. And, it was a harness that would leave no traces, that said that this was actually a murder rather than a suicide. And it was impossibly complicated. The father knew who he was when it started to go down.
Why did the reaction of his father never seem proportionate to what was going on? It was like, Bill, cut this out.
Right. And nobody, the cops, nobody knew what it was about. But he was so crazy that I think by that time anybody that knew him would just go, "What is he doing? He's just crazy." That's that's, even after his father suspected, the first thing that his father's gut told him when the brother was killed or turned up dead was that William was behind it. Of course, on that level, he knew his son. But when all this other stuff was going on, the police had that documented. It's incredible. I think I put a lot of it in the book. But nobody, he had a reputation of being the town lunatic for a long time, a dangerous town lunatic, but just crazy. I mean, you see them talking about, I think the cops called them psycho blanks, which were the forms they would fill out when they were dealing with something that they thought was related to.
Now, he also, I guess, met some junkie in New York City and was going to have him help kill his parents. He decided this guy was too much of a junkie, so he killed him. He hired another guy to go kill another person he thought was having an affair with his wife. Are you aware of, and I know you've mentioned this, of other murders that he might be a suspect in?
Sure. Well, there's the Anderson murder, of course. 1966 alone was, 1963, which was actually kind of strange, and I found this. This is a murder that came to my attention because people have thought, because of the similarities to some of the Zodiac murders, that this may have been one of the Zodiac murders that happened in Southern California. And the Zodiac supposedly claimed to have committed many murders in Southern California. It was on June 4th, 1963, two high school students, Bobby Domingo and Linda Faye Edwards, were shot to death on a beach. They went out to sunbathe on Senior Ditch Day, and they were near Gavoya State Beach, and it was just a mysterious murder that echoed very much the Zodiac. But if you look at Thorson, there's no real motive for the Percy murder. There's no motive for the Anderson murder, and the wife documents just the rages that he would go into, seemingly out of the blue, in which, as he would come out of them, it was like he had a dream. He didn't know what he was doing, and he would just, it was like the level of anger just seems almost impossible. There was also a murder which was or a body that was just identified for a 1969 murder in Los Angeles, which the press was saying that police were looking at a Manson family angle too, and it didn't strike me as a Manson family murder because they had their crazy motives for killing the people that they did, and they had a penchant for talking. And with the main crimes that were investigated, I think police basically found out just about everything they did. Not too long after all of that, there was a woman. She was from Montreal. Her name was Reet Jervison, and she was reportedly stabbed, according to some stories, 150 times. And that doesn't really fit the Manson murders. Now, of course, they were very violent. They'd stab people 18, 20 times, but not 100, 150 times. So that happened in L.A. That happened in 1969. Thorson was in L.A. a lot, I believe, starting in 62. He had a rape charge in Santa Monica. So, that's just... I can't think of anybody more crazy and violent than him.
All right. Now,
I can't think of it.
Louise Thorson goes to trial for the murder of her husband, and this is in an era before domestic violence, obviously, is something that's dealt with in the open. The first thing that struck me is that the Thorson Sr., the father, offered her $5,000 towards her defense, which doesn't sound like a lot, but in that era, it would have covered a third of her defense if she would forego taking any of the inheritance. And they made themselves scarce and wouldn't testify at the trial. So those kind of things sort of rub me the wrong way.
Oh, you know what? I'd forgotten that, if that's in the book. That's very creepy.
Yeah.
I can understand why they wouldn't want to testify.
Yeah.
But, of course, except thinking maybe that they were in sort of denial. I think on one level, obviously the gut level, when Richard turned up dead and his father said, "This is murder, where's Bill?" that he knew how bad his son was. Being able to deal with that after they were both dead that he was a product of his son, that was his son who did that. I don't, that may have just been trying to just climb back into denial or something. As far as the money goes, that to me is sick.
Yeah. All right, now we've now set this whole stage. We put this guy under the microscope. I want to go to September 1866, the night of the Valerie Percy murder. Mm-hmm. First off, what's the proximity between the Thorson home and the Percy home?
It's about a long block and a half, I would say.
Do you think there's anything that's ever been uncovered that links the Thorsons to the Percys in any way? Did they know each other?
Not that I know of. Percy obviously knew so many people because he was a politician. He was running for office. He'd been involved. I think he was a precinct captain. I think that was his first political activity at some time in the 50s in Kenilworth. So obviously the two fathers were businessmen at a very high level. So it wouldn't surprise me if the fathers, came into contact with each other at some point.
Well, how old would Thorson have been when Valerie was murdered?
About 28.
28, and she was how old?
22.
22. So it's not like they necessarily could have hung out in each other's yards and stuff?
No, and I get the feeling that Thorson was... he was such a bad kid for so long, really a holy terror. And he was kind of the nightmare millionaire son who, was riding around town and pushing people around. And so, plus the brother didn't have a good reputation either. So I think people pretty much stayed away from them. And I think at some point, one of the reasons why you can think of him as the suspect in the Anderson murder is because I think he was probably 18 or 17 at the time. He was going down to Chicago in a car with a gun, that kind of stuff.
So we don't think that he knew Valerie in any way.
No, we don't think so. And of course, remember, the 24 hours before Percy's house was broken into, the house across town, a mile away from there, a mile away from Percy's house, and even closer to Thorson's house, was broken into around the same time, 5 o'clock in the morning. And there doesn't seem to be a relationship between the...
let me ask you about that case, though. Nobody's hurt in it.
Right. That was, basically an attempted or a thwarted home invasion.
Right. And
Purisillos. The Purisillos. He was
the Purisillos, yeah, but he didn't kill anybody there, and he did it. But he did at the Percys. Where the Purisillo, is there a similarity that this guy went in the house when everybody was there, which is also nuts? Right.
They had 8 kids.
He did, but
2 parents at home, so you got 10 people in the house. I believe I'm actually pretty good friends with one of the sons now, and they've wondered all these weird things like, why did this guy come in through the second floor? Why did he climb up to the balcony when he pretty much could have just walked into our house? It was not going to be a hard house to break into. Were
they concerned that he didn't, or does it bother you at all that he didn't try and harm anybody like he did at the Percys for some reason?
Well, Mr. Purisillo got up and shouted, and he came into the dressing room, which was attached to the master bedroom. Mr. Purisillo was in the master bedroom. He got up and he called out. Mm-hmm. So Thorson's history was going into houses and snooping around. And, and I don't know, he did all kinds of things. He blew off bombs outside radio stations, and he would say it was just for kicks. Yeah. I mean, he's got millions of dollars. He doesn't need to go in and steal somebody's radio or even somebody's jewels. He's just really crazy.
Let's talk about, and this is obviously crazy in my mind, too. He breaks into the house, first off, through French doors that would not have been a logical place to try and break in. That wasn't that easy. He had to break glass, etc.
Right.
He has to go upstairs, and then people are in the house. I mean, the 2 kids from their marriage, the kids from the prior marriage, because Mrs. Percy was married before. He had to go up. He had to go up circular stairs. He had to walk by every single room that people were sleeping in, including the master bedroom. Go left and then kill Valerie. That makes almost no sense, does it?
Well, I don't know a lot of the things that he did made any sense, especially considering where he came from and what his opportunities in life were. Mm-hmm. Blowing bombs off outside of a radio station consecutively, and then getting off by reading about it in the newspaper.
Yeah. I'm just trying to think, Glenn,
right.
that if I don't know Valerie, like we don't think he did,
right.
What am I doing? First of all, I'm going to take this thrill to go into the house and everybody's there, not when it's empty, but I'm going to walk by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 potentially people and then
right.
kill the last one.
Right. And we don't know if he went in those other bedrooms. We know that Mrs. Percy woke up initially,
yes,
and said she dozed back off. She was the lightest sleeper in the house that morning. Mm-hmm. But we don't know if he went into the other bedrooms. Nothing would surprise me with him, and probably you wouldn't, you either, because you've read these books. That it's just the guy did things that You're saying he was either incredibly good or incredibly lucky. I think he's incredibly lucky, given the fact that he didn't know how to break into houses quietly.
Yeah.
He broke into houses the way amateurs break into houses, who watch movies that show people breaking into things that criminals never do. Cutting glass, making it look difficult, making it look like expertise, where the real expertise is these guys can Jimmy locks and get in 30 seconds.
Yeah, without breaking.
We're
We're down to the last minute and a half. Tell us what links to his weapons cache, what you think he did, and how he escaped.
Run that one by me again. What are the links between the
between the weapons that he had gathered and how you think she was killed and what they found?
They found the bayonet in the lake near Percy's home. I think it was 800 feet from the beach behind Percy's home, and it was a World War II Korean War era bayonet, which means it would have been 20 to 30 years old, I think, by 66. And the wounds, the head wounds from the pummel on the knife, fit the head wounds that Valerie had. Those beaches there are very highly trafficked, especially in the 60s when families were very big. I talked to the neighbor's son, and he said that kids were coming in and crashing our beaches all the time in those days. It was still summer when this happened. The knife was only about 40 feet offshore, which is about as far as someone could throw it, and only in about 4 feet of water. So it's hard to believe that it would have been out there very long in that location in the summer without being discovered by someone.
You're listening to Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell from 1490 WGCH, Greenwich, and WGCH.com, anywhere. Our final segment, we'll talk a little bit about how strong this case is. And we're back with Glen Wall. He's got this new theory on the unsolved Illinois Percy murder. It's our final segment. We're going to see how strong the case really is.
Well, you know what? I think we were going down an interesting path when you were talking about why he would have been in Kenilworth.
Right.
And what happened in Kenilworth on September 17th and September 18th. And he would have been there for, if the family had chosen to have a get-together in memory of the brother, the weekend before the anniversary, one day before the anniversary of the, brother's murder. And in the book, she says that once the brother was murdered, this guy, who already was crazy and who was already unstable, became even more so. Because, for whatever he said he regretted killing his brother. He said his brother was the only one who understood him, the only one who would experience the parents the way he did, and all these kinds of things. And he just spiraled out of that. So you think, okay, he goes back a year later. If he's there, he's thinking about his brother because he's there for his brother, and he's upset about it. He's this guy who gets up at 4 in the morning, 5 in the morning, can't sleep. Piracillos happened on Saturday morning. I mean, I don't know when the get-together would have been Saturday during the day, but obviously it would have been on his mind if he was there, and that was the reason why he was there, was the brother. It was grating on him. It was nagging him. So that's an interesting thing to think about.
Let me ask you a question right there. This means they went right from Fort Bragg to this family thing. why do you think Louise would have had no mention in the book that while they were back in Kenilworth, huge murder happens?
He was weird, scary, and she's just weird. You know, I mean, he was doing all these things that she was aware of on one level, and then he confessed in the end. And remember, he said, "Did you ever wonder why I was so afraid of being institutionalized?" And she just seemed to be a woman that never put anything together. You know, maybe that he was a liar. She didn't seem to be really, really bright.
So that he might have snuck out that sometime in that night. They're only there for a couple of days and done this horrible thing. And I guess we should be fair. At that time, she did not know that he'd killed anybody, right?
Right. And she was taking an incredible amount of abuse for about 5 years at this point. 5-6 years. Yeah. So there was a very strange stuff going on with her psychology. And also, I'm not saying, I mean, his parents' house would have been a great place to stage the murder from. I'm not sure what the relationship was, how good the relationship was. She talks about them patching things up a bit because that stuff that went on in 1965 was crazy. Yeah. You know, ripping the banisters down and throwing the bathtub down. You know, I mean, they just basically were destroying the house.
It would just seem to me logically that if they've just done this thing in North Carolina, they stop at his parents' house, a block from where they're staying, there's a big murder of a nationally known figure, that it would have gone into her book somehow, but obviously it didn't.
Yeah, you think so, but and obviously what you hit the $1 million question. I talked to the police and I said I would try and find the son and say if mother ever said anything about that murder. If anybody in the family, did the grandparents ever say anything about that murder? Did they ever say anything about, you know, somebody in the family being involved in something like that? Obviously, that would be a very good, you know, big question to ask. She lived until the mid-1990s, so she could have been asked. So potentially, and she obviously was asked a lot of things because when they had the trial with her, they reopened. They were not reopened, but reactivated the investigation into the brother's death based upon what she had said. So they kind of, you know, you would think that the authorities went back for a lot of reasons and would have gone and talked to her.
All right. In terms of evidence now, there was no DNA capability back then, but they could have done fingerprints. There was a glove, there was a moccasin left, there was the bayonet that was found, there was the broken glass, the cut screen. Was there any way that any of that was prints or anything that they could have hung their hat on besides circumstantial?
Then or now?
Either.
I would think I believe I've read articles where they talked about even in those days they would pick up fiber samples. They were looking for near microscopic evidence. They had. I know that the evidence file in Kenilworth is huge. The information from the Percy case supposedly fills an entire wall. And as far as I know, they've got the sheets. I think they may have the original mattress. So there's a lot of evidence there. It's been retested. My question, of course, would be, have they tried to bring it back to Thorson? I don't know if Thorson was, he was in trouble with the police a lot of times. They probably know his shoe size. They've got prints from him. I don't know if they can get DNA from him or from his son or, his brother's body, potentially. So I don't know, and I do not know at this point how far they would go with something like that.
Do you know, have you asked the folks in Kenilworth if they have prints on record of him from all of his arrests?
I haven't, but I can't imagine that they wouldn't because he was in so much trouble. It's possible, he was a suspect in the murder, but I don't know. At that time, the state police were investigating it, so I don't know what the state police's files would have. See, that's the problem there that I talked about when he's talked about why wouldn't the case be solved. The state doesn't have the familiarity with him that the local guys have. And the state gets in a week later, and the city's already been involved. There's just, and there's 900 other leads going on. So 2 ships passing in the night that should have been connected wouldn't surprise me if they weren't.
Good point. Now, let me ask you this. What is the basis for not releasing all of this stuff? Is it a cover-up? Just saying, well, it's open case? I mean, why not get this stuff in the air?
Well, I have become aware of cases of similar age where it appears that the police just opened it up and let people go in and who were interested in the case and, perusing this information. Probably two different ones, and I've actually made John Kelly aware of that. But I don't know. It's very interesting. This whole thing with the FBI being involved in this case in several offices, and at the same time, her father being a very powerful guy in Washington, you wonder what couldn't he have known when the FBI came over. I mean, there's one part there was one newspaper story I saw where they are talking to, Percy says something in a letter, I think it was, to one of the neighbors or a writer, and he says something about this despicable person, and you almost feel like he's saying, it seems like he knows. He feels like he knows who it was.
Interesting.
So the question is,
let me just ask you. Let me ask you this as we get down to the end. He lived up a block and a half away. Is it circumstantially in favor of looking him seriously? Was there any sign that there was a car involved, which somebody that didn't live there would have had to have to escape?
5:00 in the morning. I think when you look at what happened, that Mrs. Percy got up and she was the only one, and everybody else in the house was sleeping. A lot of people sleep very soundly.
Right.
At 4:45 in the morning or whenever this started. And that's in a very quiet place. And it was a very loud morning because the wind was blowing and the lake was churning. And and this is a place where houses are far away from each other compared to a lot of communities. So,
good point.
And people just don't expect things. I mean, I think there was a guy delivering newspapers around that time.
Mm-hmm.
But it's there was somebody who saw, there was a Northwestern student, I believe, was at a delivery job, and he saw someone there standing near Percy's driveway the evening before the murder. You would think they would have gone back to him, and even to this day, gone back to him, because if they didn't know Thorson was the guy yet, or have a lot of reasons to believe Thorson was the guy yet, did anybody ever show him the picture? I asked Kenilworth, did anybody ever go back just in recent years? Mrs. Percy is still alive. Did anybody go back and show him the picture? And I got this answer, well, she didn't really see him very well. And I'm saying, I don't care how well she saw him. I mean, if you have 10 reasons to believe this guy did it, and she saw him at all, wouldn't it be worth taking his picture back there and going, I know it was a long time ago.
Do you have a final question on this, Glenn? Do you have if it was proven that it wasn't Thorson, do you have another candidate you would put at the top of your list? Some people have even accused Mrs. Percy, obviously, the stepmother. But would you?
I mean, the problem with it being domestic violence, I think, because of the Purcillo break-in, there were 2 other break-ins directly linked to this. Yeah. One in Kennel, very nearby, across the street in Winnetka, one up in Lake Forest. So that, to me, counts out anything. I don't think anybody from the Percy family was out breaking into houses elsewhere. Plus, there just was no evidence. I mean, Joe DiLenardi, these guys were really good. They were the best Chicago had. They suspected a lot of people, and there were some other strange people. I talked to some police. There's always been some strange people in every community. Yeah. But I don't think that the ones that you hear about most in this case, the Malchows, the people connected with mob, pro home invaders going after,
people that confessed in jail and all that stuff.
They just didn't come in like a bull in a china shop like this guy did. They know how to get in quietly. They know how to get in and out. And if you don't notice the stuff is gone, you don't even know they were there.
And by the way, when we say in and out, we don't say coming in and bludgeoning someone to death while people are in the house and then not steal anything.
Right, as Joe DiLenardi said, there's many cases of home invaders who turn around and run. They're there to get the money or the jewels or the cameras. And if they can't get them, they go. And if somebody sees them, they don't want to be seen. They're out of there. They can break into thousands of more houses that they're all full of stuff.
Well, it's been a fast hour. The second time we've had Glenn. It's a very compelling case he's put together, and after 50 years, it kind of amazes me that this hasn't been something that's been taken more seriously. His book is Sympathy Vote, a reinvestigation of the Valerie Percy murder. You've been listening to Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. Look for our shows on YouTube. Search Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. Park, City Productions 06604, and our podcast at WGCH.com. We'll see everybody next Monday evening at 6 for another edition of Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell.